So as was said earlier, my name's Dave Gold. I'm the Senior Director of Sales Engineering for the Western US here at SentinelOne. And as John mentioned, I'm coming to you from beautiful Minneapolis, Minnesota today. So I live in Minnesota, but cover the entire Western US, including, Arizona and the Southwest. So a little before I dive into the talk, a little about me and why I'm talking here, or why you should think I'm maybe credible. I guess I've been in the security industry my entire career. So it's about 16 years now. I've been doing cybersecurity, information security. I primarily been on the vendor side of the house. I did start my career doing IT for a few years, but I've been on the vendor side for most of that. But I've held various roles in all sides of the business, including technical support, professional services, product management, pre-sales engineering, solution architecture. Prior to SentinelOne, I was the VP of a product of a company called ProtectWise, and we kind of define the network detection response category, so kind of the network tier of EDR. I've also worked at McAfee, Intel, Verizon, Websense, Secure Computing, so lots of the major players out there. But today, I'm going to focus on talking to you about how we can think about maybe defending systems with code-on-code warfare. And I'm going to kind of wrap up with four things that I like to think about, that I hope you all think about when you're trying to improve your organization's detection velocity and precision. So before I dive into that, I think it's really valuable to look at just some industry trends and industry data. And I do this not to scare you or saying, you're doing everything wrong, you need to change everything. But I really look at statistics and industry research as kind of a benchmark to really measure ourselves as vendors, as security practitioners, to really see if we're doing a good job, right? Let's see, I think I see a chat flashing, so I don't know if that's anything. Okay, that's a different message from John. He said the annual Managed Security Services Forum. Okay, so that's, I guess, the event that's coming up, right, John? So as I dive into these, I'm just going to share some industry statistics, and I think it gives kind of a good basis for how I like to think about things. So I think it should come as no surprise to any of you on the call that we're seeing just an increase in malware and increase in attacks every single year. AV Test publishes some really good numbers in this space. And we're really seeing growth of 8 to 16 million new variants of malware coming out every month, or new hashes or new variations of malware per month, 8 to 16 million, right? So if you look over the last 10 years, that's a 16x increase in the amount of malware. And so I think if you look at this, right, it's no wonder that, traditional AV, traditional IPS can't keep up with having signatures for all these known pieces of malware. It's just a performance issue, and it's nearly impossible to write signatures for billions of things, right? So, the adversaries are moving quickly. They're changing their techniques and tactics. They're changing, even the commodity malware that they're using, changing hashes, changing resources, infrastructure, et cetera, to make themselves moving targets. And right, we all know that we can stop them 999 times, but they only need to be successful one time. So, they're obviously changing very quickly. Another statistic is that with all those pieces of malware, with the billions of pieces of malware out there, we're also seeing that attackers are actually moving to fileless attacks, right? And these fileless attacks are where nothing is installed or executed necessarily on the victim's machine. So they're essentially using, an existing application or an exploit within the system to be able to gain control or gain access and then do things on the system. We actually did some analysis here on SentinelOne and saw that fileless attacks are increasing by 94% year over year. And the use of PowerShell, we're seeing increasing significantly too, to 5.2 attacks per 1,000 endpoints, or 5.2 attempted attacks per 1,000 endpoints within our customer environment. And we have, millions of endpoints deployed. I think this is really backed up by the Ponemon statistics that say that 35% of attacks in 2018 were fileless, and they were actually 10 times more likely to succeed. So attackers are realizing that, maybe not sending a binary or a payload, is the correct way to attack a system. Maybe they can exploit existing vulnerabilities and gain access, or even something as simple as a phishing attack and gain access. So I think that, we need to start thinking about not just how we stop file-based attacks, but how do we stop fileless attacks as well, within our environments. If I take a little bit of a change from the statistics to kind of the business drivers, right, I think once again, this stuff will come as no surprise to any of you. But just looking at some of the survey data from CISOs and, what they deal with every day, I think every vendor, everyone out there has been talking about this for a long time, but I don't think the problem's necessarily been solved, right? We know that there's not enough people to do this work, and there's way too many alerts and too little time to accomplish everything, right? Everyone that I talk to talks about the difficulties of hiring people, the difficulties of getting budget for people, and the amount of alerts that they get from their products. The average enterprise, I read a statistic a year or so ago, the average enterprise has 70 different security tools now, right? I mean, that's just crazy. And, we as security vendors used to be really proud about the number of alerts that we generated, proving our value. But I think it's very clear to customers that generating 100,000 alerts is not very valuable because they don't have the people or the time to look through those or do something about it, right? So is an alert necessarily creating value, or is it just going into a bucket where we don't have the people to look at it? There's some statistics here from the Ponemon Institute of CISOs, and on average of those CISOs, there were 17,000 alerts per week. And almost 78% of those were erroneous alerts or alerts of very little value. About 18% of those were seen as reliable alerts, and only 4% of those alerts were actually investigated, right? So we're creating all this noise, yet people aren't looking at it, and they're learning not to look at it because I don't think the vendors are necessarily doing a great job of generating reliable alerts, or they're generating so much noise that requires a human to put it back together, that this is a real challenge, right? So that 4% of alerts are manually investigated in a meaningful way. And I think that that's a real challenge, and it feeds into these CISO worries, right? The lack of in-house security domain staff, concerns with data breaches and cyber attacks and ransomware, right? These are things that keep a CISO up at night. And one more slide, just on the statistics that I like, talks about spending and the cost of cybercrime. I talk to CISOs and practitioners, almost every day. And one thing I constantly hear is, I spend more money on security every year, but I have no way to prove I'm actually safer. And I think this is a huge frustration that CISOs go back to their boards every year or their management and say, I need more budget for people and products. And the board goes, okay, we value security. We're giving you that 8.7% increase this year, but you have to be able to prove to me that that money you're spending has actually made us more secure. Or actually going to help us down the road or save us money or prevent a breach, right? And it's really challenging, I think, for CISOs to do that, because you can't prove necessarily that you stopped a breach, other than you can say you stopped a certain number of detections, right? So it's a real challenge, I think, for CISOs, and something I think vendors could actually do a better job of helping prove the value of these technologies, to the CISOs to justify it. And I think the other side of that is we're seeing the increase in the cost of cybercrime increase every year. So even though companies are spending more every year, the number of breaches is actually going up, and the cost of each of those breaches is actually going up. So it's just kind of crazy that we keep trying to spend more, throw more resources at it, yet it seems like from these statistics that we might not be winning. So I have some hypotheses about how we got there, right? I've been in this industry for a long time now, and I think that we've been kind of out innovated by the adversary, and I think we've relied on legacy technologies for too long, right? We're not driving the innovation that we need to. And I love this video here, right, of this couple that's essentially sweeping the water out, the water comes back in, sweeping the water out, coming back in. I feel like a lot of security teams, this is kind of their every day. And this has got to be pretty exhausting. Right? How long can you sweep this water before you just collapse or burn out, or need to go have a drink, right? So, if I look at some of the legacy tech, antivirus, and I used to work at McAfee, which was one of the pioneers in this space, they created a solution around detecting known threats, right? There weren't a lot of threats out there. Once they became known, you could write a signature and you could protect people. And this was pretty efficient, right? There weren't a ton of attackers. There weren't a ton of attacks, and we could, detect them. And antivirus has evolved a little bit over the years, and it's still pretty good at detecting known file-based malware. But, when you think about AV against trying to stop 18 to 16 million new samples per month, that's pretty tough, right? It's also tough when there's fileless attacks that you can't necessarily write a signature for, or advanced malware, that can be polymorphic or change itself or change its behaviors so that, AV is completely blind to it. And the other challenge with AV is if it did miss it, it never had any information to go find it later, right? So if you missed something, you didn't necessarily have the forensic data or the ability to detect something after the fact. So we've seen, I think, the effectiveness of AV decrease every year. And once again, this is nothing new to any of you, I'm sure. But AV, IPS are slowly declining markets. So to complement that was a secondary market called EDR, endpoint detection response, which was really passive. And that was designed to complement AV traditionally, right? If we said that AV was really good at the known, we could say, well, let's capture all the forensics and we'll look at that forensics and find the things we missed, and then we'll know what happened and we'll be able to stop it and learn, and that's great. So EDR was a great improvement on AV, absolutely, right? And it was really good for visibility. But I think what we've kind of seen after EDR being on the market here for 6, 7 years maybe, since kind of the market kind of sprung up, it's great for getting that visibility and that data, but it creates a lot of alerts, right? There's a lot of stuff within all that data that then somebody has to do something with typically. So you, once again, need the skilled personnel, and maybe the dwell time's too long because you actually have to dig through all that data to find things. So, I think that maybe there's an improvement on these. EDR was definitely a step in the right direction, but how can we look at improving antivirus or EDR and kind of leverage the power of the machine? So, I love this quote from Einstein, right? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, right? I think we as an industry tend to, get so focused on that reactive cycle that maybe we don't pause and just say, is there a better way? And there's a lot of technology that have come up over the last few years, which I think are moving in this right direction. I think we as an industry are trending in where we need to go. But, things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and automation and stuff are still, maturing areas of science, not to mention in the security space as well. So when we think kind of about, code-on-code warfare, I kind of want to walk you through a real-world scenario. So let's say in this scenario, a user gets an email and has a Word document attached to it that's maybe macro-enabled, right? So the user opens the document, they see that to view the content, they need to enable macros, so they click that button, and the document opens and away it goes. But in the background, we see that document calls out PowerShell. PowerShell fetches Emotet. Emotet then fetches MacTub. And then MacTub ransomware begins to run and encrypts all your files. So if you walk through that process, I want you to think, how long do you think that would take, to execute from the moment that person opens the Word document till their entire system being encrypted? So to answer that question, we actually ran this scenario in a lab, right? And so we executed this exact scenario in our lab, and we measured how long it took. So the first 22 seconds was essentially the user opening the Word doc, opening Word, enabling macros, etc. And then the rest of that attack, and I know this is a little bit of an eye chart, but you don't necessarily need to see it all, but all of that, spawning processes and ransoming this and encrypting the files and everything took another 149 seconds. So, this is all laid out in a non-fancy view, but you probably get it, right? The attacker was able to compromise the system very quickly and completely own that. So if you add all that together, that took 171 seconds to unfold. So if you think about that, right, in the time it probably takes you to stick a bag of popcorn in the microwave and pop it, that system goes from initial action to being completely owned with ransomware. So when we talk about that 171 seconds, that's kind of that 3-minute period that we talk about when we're talking about code-on-code warfare. That attacker code and how it's executing during those 3 minutes is up against whatever code we're running on the endpoint to be able to stop that attack, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about tonight, and how we can think about ways that we can, in that 3 minutes, find the threat, stop the threat before it becomes something worse. So, I mean, you definitely can respond, in the chat if you want, and this is a little bit of a hypothetical, rhetorical question maybe, right? But, what do you think costs the industry more? I think, and I can define breaches and incidents here in a minute, right? But if we think about breaches and incidents, breaches obviously are much more high profile. Those are things that usually get news, press, and stuff. And incidents are kind of the things that maybe happen every day. So if you look at the definitions there, right, a breach is something that results in the confirmed disclosure of data to an unauthorized party. So this really is something that has a legal impact to the organization. They not only have had a compromise or an incident, but data has actually been removed from the organization, or something material has happened. Incidents, of course, are usually the first part of the breach. So every breach does include an incident, but an incident is just that security event that compromises the integrity, confidentiality, or availability of an information asset. So basically losing control of a single asset. If you think about these two scenarios, we look at the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, which is a great report. I'm sure you all read it, but I spent a short stint at Verizon after they bought my last company, and this is a really strong team. I really recommend you read the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report when it comes out every year. I think probably the 2020 should be out here shortly. But in all of the things that they investigated across their customer base, they had 40,000 incidents and 2,000 breaches, right? But the average total cost of each of those, so the average cost of a breach was around $8 million to an organization. And that, of course, is all in, right? People, fees, penalties, lawyers, whatever, right? And the average cost of an incident was 1.87 million. But if you calculate these out, incidents are actually costing the industry a lot more than breaches every year because of the sheer volume of them and the impact to organizations every day of those individual systems, of saying, the system was compromised and now we have to do something about it. We have to go reimage, we lost data, all those things, add up to a significant amount of cost, to customers and to people in this industry. The other chart from that data breach investigation report, which I find really interesting, is how quickly these machines are compromised, right? We just ran that one scenario, and in 171 minutes, that machine was completely compromised. And we see that again and again in the breaches in the DBIR. And these are, of course, successful breaches that they're measuring, right? So 87% of the time, that initial compromise took minutes or less, right? But only 3% of those 87 were discovered within minutes. So 68% of those breaches actually took months to discover. And I think that this dwell time is crazy, right? Not only did it bypass our security tools or bypass these companies' security tools, but it took them months to discover there was an issue. And a lot of the actual discoveries were because some third party actually figured it out. Like, Visa made some sort of connection that your company and, credit card numbers were all linked to you as the common buyer. And they said, you probably are breached because we see a bunch of credit card numbers, in common with your organization, et cetera, right? So months before they actually discover these things. And that just is terrible, right? I mean, we even have forensic technologies now like EDR and stuff that are supposed to reduce these, but we're still seeing these very long dwell times. So when we think about code on code warfare, this is what malware can do very quickly, right? If you look at this image here, this is essentially what that malware did in the background. So when we executed in the background, we saw everything that it did, right? And in less than 3 minutes from opening that Word doc, we saw all of these processes spawn additional processes, execute commands. All of this happened very quickly because it's happening at machine speed, right? This is completely scripted, completely automated, no human intervention at this point. The machine can essentially be completely compromised. And so when we think about this, right, we really need, if we detect this after the fact, even if we detected this 10 minutes or an hour after the fact, I mean, the damage has already been done, right? I mean, EDR is great, but if we don't find about it for an hour, the machine's still ransomed, right? And at that point, what do you do when a machine's ransomed? Do you reimage it? You restore a backup, et cetera? Like, it's great if you found it an hour, but we really needed to stop it in the first 3 minutes before it did all this damage, right? And so we have to think about ways that we can leverage, the power of the machine, to be able to stop this and stop this attack, as it's escalating up and going through this process, right? And this is, if you think about like WannaCry and NotPetya and some of the the high profile attacks over the last couple of years, right? These were able to spread incredibly quickly, right? Because they basically outran and overwhelmed the ability or reactive ability for us to hunt, and really was moving so quickly that they basically were lulled into accepting their fate, right? They didn't have the tools to be able to stop it. They didn't have the technology to be able to stop it. And it kind of just ran rampant through organizations and had huge impact. So why can't we beat 171 seconds, right? I mean, if the adversaries can own us in 171 seconds, why can't we figure out a way to stop them in 171 seconds, right? Why can't we take that same amount of time, compute power to, in that time that it takes to make that bag of popcorn, find a way to leverage the power of that machine to be able to respond and block that threat faster? So, one aspect of that detection delay that I think adds some dwell time is that, some security tools are still relying on cloud reputation or cloud analytics or off-box analytics to be able to find things, right? And so we wanted to do some analysis there, right? To say, well, if this happened in 171 seconds, do we have the time to, go to the cloud and get an answer and do some analysis to get back to it, right? And, if it's just a reputation lookup, right, that should be pretty quick going to the cloud, right? You're saying, have you seen this hash before? Yes or no, and send it back, right? But when we actually looked at, cloud reputation data for executables and documents, for executables, 78% of the time, the reputation was unknown, right, across all this data. 8% it was suspicious, 14% was malicious, but 78% of the time was unknown. And documents was 96% unknown, right? So while reputation threat intel has its value, the attacks are changing so rapidly that the threat reputation is, has some value, but much like signatures, it's looking for known things, right? So when we looked at reputation, that's, 70% was unknown to the world. So, I think that, if you're relying on vendors that are looking for that kind of signature matching or hash matching, or maybe even doing, heuristics or fuzzy matching or et cetera, right? It's kind of like going to the doctor and say, my head hurts, my feet hurt, my elbow hurts, and the doctor says, yes, there's something wrong with you, right? It doesn't really help us, right, if they can't necessarily tell us it's good or bad, or we have to wait to find out that it's good or bad, and, do that within 171 seconds. The other side of this is waiting for Offbox, often done in the cloud, but maybe done on-premise as well. Things like sandboxing or static modeling or human analysis or vectorization. All of these take time, right? To send something off box and execute it in a sandbox and do some analytics, and then maybe have some humans look at it, or put it into a static model and train the model on it. This all takes time, right? And we can't do that in 171 seconds as well. So for anything that hasn't been seen before, having to send this stuff out there, can be a challenge. And having to rely on a human, right, doesn't really scale, with the number of threats, the number of attacks, right, and we all know we don't have enough people to be able to investigate and respond to that. So how can we beat this 171 seconds, right? What can we do? How do we create the velocity? How do we find a way to fight with code-on-code environment that we find ourselves in? So, I definitely, I'm open to feedback here, but I have 4 ways that I like to think about it, or 4 technologies that I hope that you'll think about considering, and I'm not going into specific vendors tonight. Obviously I do work for SentinelOne, but just 4 ways that I like to think about how you as an organization can think about improving your velocity or improving your precision in finding threats. Because it's one thing to detect and stop a threat, but you don't want to have a lot of false positives, right? You need to be precise. So you need that velocity, but you need it with precision too, because if you're killing a lot of legitimate things and causing impact to the organization, there's no way they're going to let you continue to run there, even if you're stopping all the threats, right? So it's really that balance of, we have to find ways to improve the velocity, but also the precision to find the attacks and just the attacks and stop the attacks without impacting the user or without impacting, the ability to do business. So the first is autonomous protection, right? If we're talking about code-on-code warfare, we can't necessarily wait for the cloud or wait for something off box to analyze, whether that's a human or that's a machine or that's the cloud, right? The cloud is great for management and storing and searching of data, but if we're relying on the cloud to do our detections locally at an endpoint, we're introducing dwell time and latency, right? Which is going to introduce the ability that we don't stop it before it fully executes. So leveraging, autonomous protection, this is essentially that code-on-code warfare concept, right? So how can we make the machine autonomous and able to think like all those things that are off box, but do it completely on the endpoint? So when you think about your tools, I think it's really important that the logic is local on the endpoint, that we're leveraging the power of that local machine to be able to find the threats. Because, hey, machines aren't always connected to the internet. They might not always be on your network. I mean, right now we're all working remotely, right? So we have to rely on something off box or off that machine to find that threat. We might miss it after 171 seconds. The second part of autonomous protection is, I think we need to think about how we can leverage artificial intelligence or machine learning so that we can build models to really determine if something's good or bad, right? And I think, you know, this has obviously been done for a few years now as a traditional AV replacement, right? But, you know, one of the challenges with ML models is that, you know, you have to be able to differentiate between, you know, good or bad. And you can obviously train it on, you know, lots of, the more good samples, the more bad samples you have. You know, there's a lot of interesting things you can train it on, but you have to think about breadth of coverage, and you have to think about, is the attacker using the same techniques as they used before, right? So when I think of like AI or ML, you know, I sort of think about it a little bit different. I mean, you know, I normally use the story of you come home from work and, you know, your kid's sitting at the dinner table, right? But I guess now it's you come down from your office and your kid's sitting at the dinner table, and maybe they are sitting there at the table with a fork in hand, right? And if you saw your kid sitting at the dinner table, is he inherently dangerous, right? He's sitting there at the table, it's around dinner time, got a fork, right? Maybe he has a bib on if he's young. It's the right time of day for him to have a fork, right? Nothing about that would be suspicious, right? So the idea behind static modeling is to basically take a quick look to identify intent. And that's kind of what the ML models do, right? You have an ML model that says, every day I come home, or I guess you have a human model, but in the ML concept, you'd basically say, you know, when I come down after work, my kid's sitting at the table with a knife and fork, that looks like past events that I've seen that look normal to me, right? And you would let the situation move on. And so I think, you know, a static modeling is really useful, right, to kind of identify intent, but it's still going to miss things and may have some false positives as well, right? Because maybe if somebody else came down and saw your kid there, they don't know your kid and they don't know that that's normal, right? So maybe they'll have a false positive there too. But let's kind of take that a step further, right? You know, when we talk about artificial intelligence, right? What if now that kid suddenly got up from the seat and, you know, ran with that fork and was about to stick it into the electrical outlet, right? Now there's been a behavior change for that model that might have bypassed that ML, but now there's a behavior model. And so you need to be able to say, when that behavior happens where that kid's about to do something dangerous, where they're going to hurt themselves, you know, we need to be able to identify that behavior as different than what's normal and be able to stop it at that point and save that kid, right? So I think when we think about, you know, AI or ML, you know, we really need to think about behaviors. We need to put it in context, which is really important, because just having a fork in hand is not malicious enough. When you put the whole story together and you put it into context, and then you see that change in behavior from normal, you know, I think that's where we can really, you know, find those threats. I think the other thing that I'll say around ML models is they're not all equal, right? Their effectiveness is really about building the right training set, right? So you need diverse files from multiple sources. This is kind of low bias, right? You're not just using the same sample set or the sample set that you have, but you're pulling from a lot of different sources. It's got to be representative of what's in the wild. So this would be high variance. So we need to be able to train it on lots of different types of samples that you know, cover all the different types of attacks we're seeing. And you know, we need to be able to you know, there's some informative features of these models too, right? There's kind of that dark art of or deep domain knowledge to really understand you know, how attackers and adversaries are using, you know, different file types and different things within it, and all of these things go into training the model. So you know, if you're looking at an ML type solution, you know, or an ML model, I definitely maybe have a talk with your vendors about, you know, what that looks like for them, right? How are they training their models? You know, what types of models they have? Because, you know, saying you do machine learning is like saying, you know, your product uses math, right? There's a really broad application of machine learning that I think it's important for all of us to get a better understanding of, right? And then, you know, I think obviously kind of the final point for autonomous protection is, you know, look for solutions too that have a minimal impact, because if we're adding all this ML and AI and stuff to our endpoints and we're trying to do it all autonomously on the endpoint, we need to make sure we're not having an impact on that endpoint. And I think we've seen a lot of agent fatigue over the last few years. I know I've seen it at past companies I worked at where, you know, you had 30 different endpoint agents now that have a huge performance impact on the user. And you know, to my point earlier, right, we have to have that minimal performance impact on the systems and be very lightweight. And that's where the cloud to manage these solutions and do kind of storage and searching and after the fact stuff can be very powerful. this is a total eye chart. I'm sure you can't read this all, but you guys know MITRE ATT&CK, hopefully, right? And it represents lots of different vectors and TTPs. And so I like to think about, you know, these as kind of ingredients to an attack or ingredients to the cake, right? So attackers are going to take all these different techniques, tactics, procedures, and they're going to mix them in different order. And that's basically essentially a different attack, right? But, you know, each one of these individual things is not necessarily malicious. So it's really when you're thinking about MITRE and you're thinking about, you know, maybe using MITRE as a way to improve detection, right? You need to be able to put in context, you know, what is this and is it bad, right? And so back to my example with the kid with the fork, right? You know, PowerShell is example, you know, in the MITRE attack, right? But is PowerShell itself bad? No, right? Is the action of encrypting data itself bad? No, right? But when you have PowerShell launch and then starting encrypting all your files and, you know, making persistent, you know, cron jobs and those types of things, right? Those all become, when they put together, something that's malicious, right? So when you put all these things together in the entire story, you know, that's important, right? So if, you know, you download a file that spawns PowerShell that encrypts data at a certain rate, well, that's probably bad, right? So, so I think, you know, when we think about each of these things, it's about that context, or it's about how do we bring these behaviors together to be able to detect. That kind of brings me to my second point now about how can we say, well, we could be better at detecting threats if the machine can use its rapid compute power to be more predictive and look at behavior, or use artificial intelligence to look at the behavior on that system. So, you know, for behavioral prevention, it may be valuable to map each of those to that MITRE framework to say each one of these individual techniques, right, is important, right? But we need to link those together and weigh each of those actions and evaluate them as a whole, right? So when you're thinking about AI technologies, you know, definitely look at solutions that that can weigh each of those individual behaviors and aren't just tied into, you know, known TTPs, et cetera, but can look at all the different types of behaviors that could be out there and score them individually, but link them together into a story to be able to detect threats. These types of technologies are really good for detecting both file and fileless-based attacks, right? ML is good for, you know, that initial analysis, right, of saying, yep, that behavior, that file looks pretty good, right? It looks like something good or it looks like something bad. But behavioral is actually what's happened after the fact, after we just glanced at that file quickly. So, you know, back to that example I used with the kid, right? The behavioral engine was when he starts running towards that electrical outlet with the fork in hand, right? Your brain analyzed it very quickly as a human. You were able to reach out, snag him, and stop him, right? That's the behavioral analysis. We basically need the machine to do that as well, right? We need the machine to say, you know, PowerShell running, totally normal behavior on my system. But, you know, as soon as that PowerShell or that kid starts running towards the electrical outlet and starts becoming malicious, right? That's when we need to do something to stop it, right? I think another example of autonomous technology is vehicles, right? And I'm not necessarily talking about like self-driving Teslas and stuff here, although those are very cool. But I'm talking about like the tech that's in a lot of cars that, you know, just helps you react quicker, right? And so these basically cars sense that there's a car approaching at a fast rate in front of you, can actually stop, right? So the car in front of you slams on their brakes, your car detects that brake lights, you know, through a camera, and senses the velocity change. And then your car behavioral model says they see brake lights at a certain range, and I see them decreasing velocity over a certain period of time, and I'm this far away. So I have to stop now or I'm going to lose control and that sort of things, right? So, you know, you essentially would want your car to be able to completely be autonomous, be able to detect that behavior change, right? That car braked in front of you, you're going a certain rate of speed, you're a certain amount away from it. You need the machine to be able to make that decision. You know, a car braking in front of you is normal behavior, but when, you know, you're going a certain speed and they're a certain distance away, those behaviors now have additional context. And so, you know, we really need the car to be able to make those decisions. And that's what I think we need to think about, you know, our endpoint security tools too. We need to be able to make those decisions very quickly, you know, for us and on our behalf, right? Because once again, we're trying to beat that 171 seconds. We have to do that code on code. And so predictive and AI technologies are going to be really powerful here to be able to find these types of attacks that maybe don't have a binary or maybe don't have a file. The third way is really the contextual and correlated forensics. And this is really, I think the evolution of EDR, right? EDR, if you don't already have it, I really recommend you get an EDR solution because getting that visibility and forensics into the endpoint is huge, right? But to just collect all that data and then require a human to dig through and make sense of all of that, isn't very efficient. And, you're going to have, it's going to take you months to find those missed threats, right? And we've seen that in the Verizon data. So, if that average undetected threat is 80 or 100 days, you need at least that much forensic data, but you also need to reduce the dwell time. And this is where taking that EDR data, but properly labeling it or grouping it together, is very helpful to be able to tell that entire story. We at SentinelOne use a concept that we call active EDR, but it's sort of basically saying that it's one thing to capture all the data, but it's another thing to be constantly making sense of that data, labeling that data, grouping that data, correlating that data, to be able to make sense of it in very interesting ways. I think another thing that you need to think about in your EDR data is not just capture the data, but what do you do, with that data? Can you create watch lists or, threat hunting hypotheses? So a lot of people talk about threat hunting with EDR and, kind of talk about it being searching for IOCs or those types of things. But, searching for IOCs or even, indicators of attack, those are kind of table stakes. That's not really threat hunting. To me, threat hunting is hypothesis testing. So hypothesis testing is essentially saying, I have a hypothesis that an attacker may use X, Y, or Z technique, and they may, be coming from externally, and they may use PowerShell, and I want to go see if I've seen that on my network before, right? So, being able to take that data and search, based on those behavioral indicators to, essentially find things that match those hypotheses or even alert off those things, I think is really important. And the fourth one, is really around that automated remediation and response, right? So automation is kind of the last piece here that I think is really important. And it's great that we've seen SOAR technologies come up in the last few years. It's great that we see vendors finally opening their APIs and being willing to work with other tools, because it's what customers have been asking forever, right? I've worked at some large security vendors, and their stance was, well, if you have everything from us, everything will be great, right? And that's just not realistic for customers. It's not realistic, because A, one company is not going to have all the best products necessarily, and B, you buy products over time. You don't just buy them all from one vendor. So you're going to have a mix of products, and you want them to work together, right? That's what every organization wants, so their security tools to make each other more valuable. I used to work with Netflix a long time ago, and they had an expression that they'd tell me that, if I've got 10 products and one works with the other 9, it's my most valuable product, right? So think about, how your tools work together and can automate. And think too about the R in EDR, right? The response side. I think that's often overlooked too on the endpoint too, of if a breach is not successfully stopped in 171 seconds, and obviously we think with ML and AI and some other technologies, as these continue to evolve, over the next few years, that we'll be able to stop a large percentage of those. But, no product's ever 100%. So what do you do when a breach does get through? How do you find that threat faster? And how do you recover from it? Can you roll back that system? Can you recover those files? Can you use your APIs to integrate with other tools and other products to streamline the digging through data and searching of data and adding contextual data and linking those different data lakes together, right? That it's so important to be thinking about the recovery side of it too. And NIST has obviously been around forever, right? But I always think about NIST and identify and protect are where we really invested a lot in the early years. But respond, detect, respond, and recover, right, are also equally important, right? So how do you recover? How do you bring your tools together? And how do you do this in an automated way that doesn't require a human, hours of time? When we go talk to incident response teams, they sometimes spend, upwards of an hour per incident, right? And this is why, we just can't respond to things fast enough. So I want to bring it back, before I kind of open questions here, to one of the reports I talked to earlier, which is another great report I like. It's the Accenture Cost of Cybercrime report. And this is the one I referenced earlier, saying the cost of cybercrime is going up every year, right? But one of the statistics I really like, there's some tables at the end of the report that they call net technology savings, right? And this basically takes the cost of any type of technology minus minus the amount that it provides value, right? And so one of the things that really jumped out at me was automation, AI, and machine learning was #2 on this list. So it's, what is it, $2 million is the net technology savings from this type of technology, right? And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? If we're automating tags, repeatable processes, we're using AI and machine learning to be faster, detecting threats and acting like humans. And these technologies, you know, aren't ridiculously expensive. The net technology savings is incredibly high. The only thing higher than it was security intelligence, and my hypothesis there, you know, from the report is security intelligence and threat sharing. It's very cheap, right, and has value in detecting known things. So you know that definitely has a good you know, net technology savings. But automation, AI, and machine learning, I think, are really the next big area where, you know, organizations are investing, and we've already seen this over the last few years, right? That companies are investing in those types of technologies that are bringing more value to the organization, making their teams, you know, more efficient. You know, can help weed out the noise, help focus analysts on just the things that require a human, and that's where, you know, I think we can have huge gains, not only in that quote-unquote warfare, but just as an industry as a whole. And the other thing that's interesting to me about this is, you know, I started my career in firewalls, and you know, the advanced perimeter controls are now negative, right? So you're actually getting less value than what you're paying for these tools. And I think this is pretty obvious why. I mean, if we probably ran this report today, it would probably be, you know, even worse, right? Because nobody's actually behind the perimeter currently. We're all working remote, we're all working from home, right? And maybe we're VPN'd in, but it's just interesting that these very expensive perimeter controls, you know, are no longer the things that are providing a lot of value to an organization. They're expensive hardware. You have to put them everywhere. You know, stuff's moving to the cloud. And so, you know, can use automation, AI, machine learning, and can, you know, maybe a great place to start is at the endpoint, because the endpoint is always with that system, you know, can autonomously protect and provide that value. It doesn't require the user to be on the network, doesn't require, you know, the connection to the internet or the cloud, right? And so if you look at those types of products, you know, I think that there's some real gains there. So hopefully this has been interesting for you guys. I think I can wrap it up there.